Welcome to Transforming Social Justice. My name is Megan Futrelli, and I serve as the proud CEO and Chief Empowerment Officer of Us Squared. Today, we're going to be talking about ageism and how this form of discrimination impacts organizations, both in the business world and in the educational environment. I have Justinne, our programming coordinator, with me to support the conversation. Justinne, how are you today? Thank you for joining us. And could you start by just sharing with the audience how we define ageism within Us Squared?
Yes, hi Megan, hi everyone. Again, as Megan shared, I'm the programming coordinator for A Squared, and I'm very excited to share some information with everyone today. Here at A Squared, we define ageism as discrimination, prejudice, and or stereotyping based on someone's perceived or actual age.
Justinne, I noticed you said perceived. Why is that so important for us to discuss, or why is that included in the definition?
Thanks for asking, Megan. I think that's a good question. And for example, in society, we make assumptions about someone's age based on their appearance or job seniority and other things like that. And I know we talked about this before about the shock you receive when you tell people you're retired.
Yeah, that's a great example. I often receive, "What? You're too young to be retired," or "I've been out of the school system for nearly 7 years," and I still get that comment. What's interesting is that when I was in the school system, I would hear the same thing. "You're too young to be a principal. You're too young to be a superintendent," always telling me what I was too young to do. Um, and since leaving the school system, I've heard from many that ageism is actually a really common issue across multiple sectors. So, from schools all the way to corporate. Um, and that there's a lot of people dealing with very similar comments and even more blatant discrimination simply based on their age.
So from those things you heard, what does or what can it look like? What does ageism look like in the workplace?
Honestly, Justin, this is most common if we were to talk about those generational differences in the workplace. So, we actually have right now in our workplace up to 5 generations working together right now. We have baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and Generation Alpha. And without better understanding some of the nuances of these generational differences, organizations are finding themselves in some pretty extreme culture shock moments.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I think I see that sometimes. But what are some of those moments, and how can organizations bridge that gap that exists across and between these generations?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind, we actually spoke about a little bit on our other episode for the podcast. So, just a quick reminder for everyone, we have two episodes every month for our podcast. One is the one we're in now, where we'll be talking about business focused case studies, examples, ways that leaders can transform their organizations. And then the second is a more personal podcast sharing our personal anecdotes and experiences around the topic for the month. And we spoke about this in that podcast as well. But it's the idea of work ethic or work life balance. I personally don't use the phrase work life balance, simply because I don't think it's an opportunity to turn off and turn on. I use work life integration. However, these phrases in and of themselves mean something a little different to almost everyone. And we need to get to a point where we can really understand one another without judging different opinions that people have. And I think when we're thinking about work life balance, a lot of times, depending on what generation you're from or your own personal experiences, you might define that differently. And ultimately, in the workplace, we simply need to be clear about expectations attached to a deliverable, right? So we need this project done by this time rather than micromanaging every piece of how it gets done. So that will allow people to define their own work life balance because we're focused on a project and the expectations, the end result. Um, And I think the other piece is, especially with virtual work right now, if it isn't important that someone is at their desk in front of their computer from 9 to 5, I often invite businesses to consider flexible work schedules. If a task is actually accomplished, is it critical for someone to stay at work just sitting there? Depends on the type of job they have, right? Is it critical for someone to be at a specific location to be able to do their job? Probably not. I mean, it depends. Every job is different. Within my company, within our company, we have pretty flexible work schedules as long as tasks are getting done, right? And we also have the ability to work from wherever in the world people happen to be. Um, People who used to work 60 plus hours a week used to wear that as like a badge of honor, right? And now we're in this stage in society, and I think all of us need to be able to acknowledge how much that has shifted, that it's really unhealthy, and people do not look at the idea of how many hours you're working as how successful you are. I will say that I still have weeks where I'm working 70 or 80 hours. Absolutely. And then there's weeks where I'm working 20 or 30 hours. And I'm looking forward to, in a couple weeks here, I'm going to actually take a real vacation and with my family and just be away. And I'll probably work 5 hours, right? Because I don't see myself, when I said work life integration instead of work life balance, that work life integration is when you truly love what you do, you're constantly looking at the world through that lens. You're constantly looking for ways that you can improve your work performance on the job, even when you're off the job, right? And I think the idea of people working so many hours and having that be the pinnacle of what we want for a good employee, I would rather have employees who are working 30 to 40 hours and really happy and being productive and getting all their stuff done. I would love that. Um, and I think that has shifted over the last few years, specifically around age and generational differences. Another example is the impact of different societal events. For example, I'm thinking about how 9/11 changed our workforce dramatically, and COVID-19 absolutely changed our workforce. And as leaders, we need to understand the impact of life experiences on how we view the world or our output. What we define as success shifts with those major life changing moments like COVID-19 and 9/11.
Yeah, you mentioned those two things, 9/11 and COVID-19. With both of those, like, we see other identities under attack, not just age, but does that impact ageism at all, those two events?
Absolutely. What you're referring to is the idea of intersectionality, right? So intersectionality is when identity groups will merge to create someone's true or authentic identity. None of us are just one component, right? And we are all intersectional beings. For COVID-19, we saw people of Asian heritage discriminated against at a really high rate. We saw the response to that was Stop Asian Hate, but even to this day, we're still seeing some of that. Um, and the reason why that looks at ageism as well is, depending on what age you were when COVID-19 hit, you were at a different stage in your own personal development. So you were either being impacted with your first thoughts if you were before the age of 12. So children who were before the age of 12 with COVID-19, that's what they viewed the world as. They were creating their world lens before the age of 12. And then if they were between the ages of 12 and 25, they were creating that frontal lobe, right? They were creating all of the different grooves in their brain and making those connections. And then people past the age of 25 were just gaining more experiences to reflect on, to be able to see the world differently or to shift their own core beliefs. After 9/11, we saw people of Middle Eastern descent and people perceived as Muslims getting profiled and discriminated against at really high levels. Um, Depending on the generation, like I just shared with COVID-19, they were either working, growing up, or possibly not even born yet when 9/11 happened. 9/11 was in 2001. So we have people in our workforce right now today who were not even born when 9/11 happened. And it's critical for us to acknowledge that something so monumental across the globe impacted the entire globe. There are people in our workforce today who did not experience it firsthand. They were not even alive when it happened, but it still had a long lasting effect. And we're going to be talking about this same piece in about 20 years with COVID, where we will have people who were not in the midst of the COVID shutdown. So, if we're thinking specifically about 9/11, anyone born between 1989 and 2001 were in their formative years when 9/11 happened. So, they were creating their first thoughts, they were creating those implicit biases in their brains, right? People born after 1981 were likely either working or finishing up college when it happened, right? So, they were probably kind of going through, they were either working in an environment and saw the impact, or they were finishing up college when 9/11 actually happened. And those born after 2001 were born into a post 9/11 world. There are people today, I know myself, I was born post the civil rights movement, right? But the civil rights movement still impacts every moment of my life, specifically because of the work we do at Us Squared, also because I have a Black son in America, also because there are still remnants of what we did during the civil rights era and during that movement to try and create a more equitable environment. So when we're thinking about different events in our history and different generations, that impacts how we perceive different age groups, which is all a part of ageism, especially in the workforce.
Yeah, I understand, and I never really thought about those events like that because I was born just a little bit before 9/11 happened, and I'm also born overseas. I'm born in the Philippines. But I think I resonate with that, although I have a very different experience. In the Philippines, there are similar events in our country that shifted its history. Like, for example, the uh EDSA People Power one that happened in 86, I think 1986, to overthrow the dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., which can be an entire conversation in itself because his son is now our president. The dictator's son is the country's president now, which is, another
Wow.
conversation to have. And EDSA People Power 2, which happened around, I think, the same year that 9/11 happened in 2001 to overthrow another president. And the EDSA revolution in 86, my mom was in high school or in college, I think, and she participated in some of the protests. And you would see a difference with how she sees and perceives things, not just politically, but society in general. Versus, of course, I understand some of it because she imparts her knowledge and what she knows and what she's learned. Versus what I know and what I've experienced with hers, is you can definitely see a difference there.
Yeah. So when you talk about the overthrow of the president in 86, that was before you were born, correct?
Yes.
But it still impacts you. And I think that's something for us to think about is think about what age we are when certain things happen, because that shifts how we view the world, and how we view the world will definitely impact our communication. Thank you so much for sharing that. Have you noticed that your age has played a part in any jobs that you've had or jobs that you've applied for, maybe?
Funny that you asked because this is a very, very distinct experience that I have in one of the companies that I worked for. I worked for a firm. I was one of their first employees. I started like first 10 people probably, and then it grew to like 100, and I was still there. And because of that uh, coming from a startup, they were hiring more young people. I think I was like 20 when they hired me probably, and then I grew with them. So an experience that I had in that company was I had a professor in university who retired, and then retired from the university, and then applied uh, for a role in the company. And because I grew with the company, after a couple of years, I was team leader. And when I was team leader, the person who was my professor in university became part of my team in that company. So I think I had, for quite a bit in the beginning of both our journeys of that professional relationship, I struggled a little bit because he was my professor. He was literally grading my papers. I think he struggled technologically as well a little bit. So they sat him next to me, and I was having a little bit of a struggle navigating that relationship. I called him sir because he was my professor, even though I was his team leader at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. That must have been interesting. Do you think that he struggled with it as well?
I'd say so, and the good thing about that is he was communicative about it. He was,
Mhm.
I think it was more on my end that I can't shake off the fact that he was my professor, but he was very honest and communicative that uh,
Yeah.
he understands the dynamic of the relationship, and he respects it despite our age difference and our previous relationship, despite him being my professor, previously my
Yeah.
professor.
As you share that story, Justin, I think back. So when I first graduated from undergrad from college and got my first teaching job, I actually taught in the same school district that I went to school in. So I had graduated 4 years prior to that from the high school. My high school principal was the person who ended up hiring me because he had been moved into an HR role. And when I went in to start my teaching career, I was in a room for the Teacher Institute, the in service day, the onboarding day with my previous teachers. And now they were my colleagues. I was not their supervisor, but I was their colleague, not their student. And I remember I still called them Mrs. All of my teachers were female, so it was still Mrs., right? But it was Mrs. So and so, right? I called them Mrs. Grant, Mrs. Morose, Mrs. Schweitzer. I did not call them their first name. And they would constantly say, Megan, we work together now. You can call me my first name. I'm like, no, I can't. And to this day, I actually just had lunch with she was my first grade teacher. And then I ended up working with her. And we just had lunch a couple months ago, and I was still calling her Mrs. Schweitzer. I could not call her first name. And I'm having lunch with a teacher. She was not my teacher, but I did student teaching with her. And I volunteered in her classroom when I was a high school student. And I'm having breakfast with her tomorrow. Um, but I don't know if I'll be able to call her by her first name. She was never my teacher, but because I met her as Mrs., I don't know if I'll be able to change that. And I think that definitely hits on the ageism component and just that respect factor of, and Reese is not allowed, Reese is my son, he is not allowed to call anyone by their first name. It has to be Mr. or Miss or Mrs. or aunt or uncle. Um, that's something we go. But I digress. One of the things that we hear quite a bit from our clients when we're working with them is they want to know what they can and cannot ask during an interview regarding age. The simple question that I always answer here is, can the person you're interviewing accomplish the task and duties outlined in the job description? If yes, that's all you need to be concerned with. You don't need to know how old they are, right? Oftentimes we ask information out of curiosity and not out of necessity. So, what I will tell everyone who's listening to this is, if you are concerned about that, or if you're wondering what questions am I allowed to ask, I want you to think, is it you want to know because you're curious, or you want to know because it will impact their ability to do the job? Because if it is going to impact the ability to do their job, then you have to ask those questions. But I would also venture to ask you if age would truly impact anyone's ability to do the job unless you are basing that assumption on stereotypes, right? So another thing we hear is, well, we don't ask the age, but then I look at their application or their resume process. There are things that can insinuate information around age that are still present on applications, and I strongly invite and encourage HR people to take a look at this. If you are asking when someone graduated high school or college, that can sometimes give insight on age. We know that that's not 100% accurate because people can go back to college, they can finish high school a little bit later, a little bit earlier, but asking people when they graduated is not as important as asking if they graduated. Asking if someone graduated is important. Many roles consider or require a degree, right? But asking when they graduated, my question is that actually necessary for them to be able to do the job, right? Now, people will sometimes come back and say, but I need to know for paperwork. If you end up offering the job and they accept the job and they have to fill out their onboarding paperwork, you're going to ask for all of that information. You're going to ask about birthday, you're going to ask about graduation dates. But that is after the position has been offered and the new employee is completing that onboarding paperwork. That is the only time that it is necessary or appropriate to ask about age or birthday or graduation years, etc.
Yeah. Do you find that companies are hesitant to hire certain age groups?
Unfortunately, yes. We have spoken to many individuals who have been passed over for positions due to their age. Um, some are told that they need more experience, right? So that's often the younger generation. Others are told that they're overqualified. Um, and my personal opinion, that term is typically a nice way of saying no, thank you. It's almost like the it's not me or it's not you, it's me type of thing. If someone is aware of the position and the rate of pay and still applies for the position, then I encourage the employer to reflect on why they feel that person is overqualified. So, for example, we'll often hear, well, I don't know why they're applying for this job. They're way overqualified. And my question for them is always, did you post the job roles and responsibilities and description? And did you post the range of pay? And as long as that is all there and accurate, then it is not up to us to determine what that person is going to be worth or what that person wants to do next. There's a lot of reasons why someone might take a position that they're overqualified for, right? For example, I was a superintendent. There have been times where I've thought about going back into teaching, maybe as a substitute teacher, maybe as different things, right? I don't have any desire to go back into the administrative world, but I might want to go in to be a professor or a teacher. And my reasoning might be because I want the flexibility of not working 80 or 90 hours a week. When I was an administrator, I was working a lot of hours, right? There are going to be people who might be from manager level or C suite level, and they're just really burnt out. It's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress to be at that high level of a position. Maybe they're coming in and they want a position with not as much ultimate responsibility. So I really encourage businesses to look at what they mean when they say someone's overqualified. As long as all the criteria is there and the person still chooses to apply, that's not up to us as hirers or hiring agents to determine whether it's a good fit or not, as long as it is a good fit for the qualifications. Another concern that we hear from hiring departments or officials is that they're nervous to hire someone who's close to retirement because they don't want to put all that time and energy into training and then they leave. I'm sure this isn't a shock to anyone, but that is absolutely illegal. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission protects against discrimination based on race, religion, gender identity, and disability. In addition to those direct protection of those classes, the EEOC also states that policies that negatively impact applicants or employees over the age of 40 are prohibited. What I find interesting is over the age of 40. 40 is not even mid age. Like when we talk about midlife crisis, that usually happens around the age of 50. So the EEOC is protecting before midlife even occurs. They're considering, the EEOC considers anyone over the age of 40 to be a protected group. It's wow.
Yeah, I'm shocked with 40 because 40, it's not like 40 is young, right? Why? I'm
Yeah,
curious why 40. That's a shock to me.
I don't know. When I first saw that, I have to say, I was like, oh, what? I mean, I'm I'm over 40, right? I mean, I'm like, wow, I'd be protected right now. I don't know. It was that moment. Um, I remember when I first started my career right out of college, I remember thinking that 40 was old, right? I had the mindset of the EEOC, like, oh, I need to be protected at age 40. I'll be all of these perceptions, right? Then it became 50 and then 60. And I was just sharing this earlier, but I feel like my threshold for what's considered old increases at least a decade, like every year.
Yeah. And we're speaking about numbers, and earlier in the conversation, we were talking about how this is the first time that we have a workforce that's five generations, and you talked about those generations. Do you have any recommendations for how leaders can promote these multi-generational workforces?
Yeah, absolutely. Many organizations have ERGs or employee resource groups. In addition to these ERGs, organizations can adopt the idea of affinity groups. Affinity groups are slightly different from ERGs. So, ERGs are groups that are meant to educate about another group. Affinity groups are people who self identify as whatever that group is. They're meant to serve as opportunities for people to be alongside others within a community that resonate with an identity and for people that share that same identity. And these can be used really effectively when discussing age and generations. So at Us Squared, we've actually helped organizations share insights and open forums with people from different generations to swap stories and learn about one another. So they utilize affinity groups to come together to identify others who fit into that same group, that affinity bias or that affinity circle. And then they use ERGs to help promote and swap stories and encourage conversation. Oftentimes, much of the struggles surrounding age are based on not understanding one another. So if you allow that open conversation and you openly discuss some of the stereotypes and you learn to value unique attributes rather than assigning values or attributes based on identities, you'll grow as an organization, right? If you learn to value one another. So what we talked about earlier with the work-life balance, allowing people from different backgrounds who have different perceptions of what that looks like to share what that means, you might be able to come to more of a common ground.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a really great idea. But I also wonder, like, what if someone's experiencing ageism in the workplace? Like, personally, what do you recommend to them?
Yeah, this is a great question and one that I can offer my thoughts and insights. But I also want to remind everyone that I'm not a lawyer, right? And many companies have their own policies regarding discrimination of all forms, including ageism. Um, so I will share some things that we have found that works very well. At the same time, again, following up with HR or legal counsel is also a great option as well. Um, with all of that being said, the first thing I invite you to think about or look at is the relationship with the person making the comments. Do you know them well? Do you realize do they realize that they're acting in a way that embodies ageism, right? Are they able to self reflect, and do they actually have that self awareness to know that they're doing that? And this is important because, as we talk about at Us Squared and as one of our core principles states, intentions don't always equal impact, and we can't be held responsible for things we don't know. Now, just a reminder, right? This is not meant to be used as an excuse to not learn, right? So we can't be held responsible for what we don't know, and we can't use our lack of knowing as an excuse to not learn and do better. Now, if you have a relationship with the person making the comments and you believe that they don't know that the comment is rooted in ageism, there's a 7-step process that you can go through. Okay. So the 7-step process first, and again, this is for people that you have a relationship with, whether it's a colleague relationship or a supervisor relationship, but someone that you have a relationship with, so you have some history, and you believe that they don't actually know that what they're saying or doing is ageist in their response. So, number one, I invite you to ask them for permission to share how a comment impacted you. So, you're going to say, I would like to talk to you about a comment that you made. Can we have that conversation now? Or do you have a minute? Or are you willing to have that conversation with me? When you ask for permission, people are much more likely to embrace the conversation. Okay. Then the second step is you want to remind them of your relationship and acknowledge that you don't believe it was said to hurt you. This is what we call priming the pump. Okay. What I mean by that is you want to kind of give them some information beforehand. You want to make them feel good so that they know that you're not attacking them. That will allow their defenses to come down, right? Then you want to go into the facts of what was said. So you don't start with how it made you feel. You start with, yesterday you made this comment at this meeting, right? You're just going to share the facts. Then you're going to share how it made you feel without blame. You're not going to say you did this. You're going to use I statements. When this was said, I felt. So you use an I statement and you only refer to how it made you feel. Do not talk about how it made other people in the audience feel or other people in the meeting feel. Only share how it made you feel. Then you want to ask them to share what they meant by the statement. You can even go a step further and revert back to what you talked about earlier of, I know that you didn't mean to hurt anyone. I know that you're a good person. I know that you don't have this deep-seated hatred or this belief within you, but I'm wondering what you meant, right? Because I know that you didn't mean to hurt anyone. Can you tell me what you did mean by that statement? Then after you get that understanding, then you want to ask if you can share alternatives to what was said. So you bring out, so instead of saying, I have shoes in my closet older than you, which I understand was meant as a joke on your part, maybe you could say something like, wow, I would love to learn from your experience and I'd love to share my experience with you. There's no need to throw around ages or how much of a difference there is in age. And then you want to close out the conversation with appreciating one another and making sure that you're all on the same page. It really needs to be a back and forth conversation. If it's one-sided, it allows defensiveness to come in. Now, again, that was all if you have a relationship and you believe that the conversation was not done to purposely hurt anyone. Now, if you don't have a relationship with the person making the comments, and you probably don't know if there was malintent or not, because if you don't know the person, you don't necessarily understand their intentions or their background, I invite you to either speak to someone else that knows the person to gauge their intentions, or if you feel safe to do so, ask clarifying questions about what was meant by the comment. So you can start off with, I know we don't know each other well. I would like to understand more about what you meant with that statement, right? If you believe the comments were made purposely to hurt, minimize, or invalidate, go through your HR process to report the incident. So we strongly encourage direct conversations as much as possible. At the same time, if someone is purposely hurting someone else, especially with discriminatory comments. Most, if not all, companies have a policy in place to avoid discrimination and to make sure that that does not happen in the workplace. We believe that addressing conversations directly are much more effective to inspire change, and we recognize that those policies are put in place for a reason. And we recommend speaking to your HR department to identify the proper protocol for your specific company.
That is a lot of helpful information. And we also talk about diversity of thought and how it's critical in these organizations. But do you believe that diversity of age is important to include in leadership?
Absolutely. With diversity of age comes a diversity of experiences, and it's only when we surround ourselves with multiple perspectives and listen to one another that we can truly be more inclusive. I strongly encourage organizations to diversify their leadership teams and workforces. When I say this, I want to be very deliberate that this includes all identities: age, race, gender, sexuality, religion, ability, etc., not just age, like we're talking about today, but all of the different identities. Because again, with different identities comes different experiences of how we view the world, which allows us to diversify how we solve problems in our organization. As organizational leaders, it's our responsibility to ensure that everyone in our organization is seen, heard, welcomed, and valued.
Megan, thank you so much for all of that very helpful information. And also, thank you to everyone who stayed and listened throughout. If you have any questions that you would like to ask Megan and our team to answer next time in the next podcast, please drop a comment, or you can also send us an email at info@us2consulting.com.
And also, Justin, we can also remind everyone you can subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch both podcasts and to follow us on social media at Us2 Consulting. Sounds great, everyone. And don't forget, we have two different podcasts. This is more business focused. We have another one that's more personal anecdotes. Looking forward to talking to y'all again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.